All right, church family, Exodus chapter 21. So we have been through the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. We closed last week we closed out the Ten Commandments. We talked about how they represented kind of this natural law that God was formalizing and sharing with us. We talked about the response of the children of Israel, just immediate awareness of their sinfulness and the shame that goes along with that. Of course, Adam and Eve in the garden, when they sinned against the Lord, shame immediately resulted as well. They were immediately shameful. And we see that in the children of Israel here, where they're shocked, they're overwhelmed. They say, Moses, we cannot bear. Who can bear to talk to God and live? We need you to mediate for us. We need you to be the go-between. We cannot stand before a thrice holy God. And so they recognize their sinfulness, their shortcomings, their complete inadequacy to meet what we think of as very basic rules. And when we talk about the law in the abstract, we think about the law of Moses. Sometimes our minds go straight to the complexity of the ceremonial laws and the civil laws and the making of the tabernacle and all the offerings and the rules that surround them. And we kind of think of that as being, kind of complex and scary, in large part because it's less familiar to us, right? It's harder to relate to. But the children of Israel were shocked and ashamed and horrified at the Ten Commandments. What we might think of as being super basic. Don't steal, don't kill, don't covet, only worship God. We say these things and we think of them as being very, very basic and simple. But they recognized how far short of even that mark they would fall. And certainly Christ had a great deal to say about those. We kind of talked about how Christ elaborated on those in his Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere. But now God has made provision for them. God in response said, hey, what the children of Israel are saying is good. They are rightly recognizing themselves as sinners, as unable to keep this law. So you know what? When you build an altar, despite the fact that you are sinners, that you do fail to meet my requirements, God says, let's make a way for you to commune with me. Let's make a way for sacrifice. And when you do that, here's how you do that. And he gives them instructions about the making of an altar and how they're to do that. He then proceeds, as we'll go on and discuss today, in chapters 21 through 23. We're not going to read that whole passage. Obviously, we would quickly run out of time if we were to try and read all of that. But in chapters 21 to 23, we read a series of civil laws that provide some structure to what is going to become the Hebrew nation. Very high level, very basic, deals with some basic applications of what God expects of people in those 10 commandments as they are worked out through the day-to-day life of the people. And that's what happens in Exodus 21 to 23. Really touches on, I would say, about 8 or 9 different areas. It sets ground rules for indentured servitude. We tend to think of that as slavery. Most of the time, in most contexts in Scripture, we tend to see really 2 sort of versions of this that are generally talked about. The first is true indentured servitude, as is talked about here, where someone basically sells themselves as a laborer in response to a debt or for money or something like that. It's a little less like chattel slavery than we might be inclined to think of in Western societies, although we will see some parallels to chattel slavery here as we work through this passage. The other kind is more the conquest of peoples kind of slavery, not the individual enslavement of people, but the subjugation of a group of people where they now have tasks that are assigned to them, much like the children of Israel experienced when they were in Egypt. I think of the Gibeonites, right, becoming hewers of wood and drawers of water. I suspect that there was not each Gibeonite was held in a home and they were beaten and shackled and enslaved in that sense. It was more like, hey, you group of people, you're your own class. These are the jobs you can do. You're limited in what you can do in society generally. But you're still going to your own house. You're still cooking your own food. You're still living somewhat independently. It's more of an enslavement of them as a people. Or indentured servitude as a people, you might say. Those tend to be more the examples that we see in Scripture in how these things were conducted. Slavery was a norm throughout the ancient world. Generally speaking, here as well as elsewhere, when we think about things that today we would associate with civil rights or social welfare, we always see in Scripture an elevation of people from the social norms of their day. We never see in Scripture where the standard is being lowered for God's people relative to the other cultures and societies around them. That doesn't mean that today we would be justified to treat people in some of the ways that are outlined in Scripture. I think the idea here more is that slavery has been normalized throughout the world at this time, and God sets safeguards in place or boundaries against the worst challenges of dealing with that in their time. And we'll see some examples of that as we work through this passage. Undoubtedly, there were wicked masters during this time who did, in fact, make things look very much like Uncle Tom's Cabin, chattel slavery that we would think of in the Western world. But those people would have been marked and noted by the people around them as violating the law of God in these areas. There really is no question as to certain standards of decency that are outlined here, both in Exodus, and then if we were to go on, we could also see in Leviticus and even a little bit of Numbers. We'll see other elements of the law that touch on these activities and elaborate on them a bit more. What's in chapters 21 to 23 is relatively brief. At any rate, I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself there. These sections talk about indentured servitude, specifically for Hebrews. Foreigners are handled in a different passage in Leviticus, but specifically indentured servitude for Hebrews is kind of our first big chunk. He also talks about issues of personal injury, theft, property damage, honesty and our dealings with others, sexual immorality, various civil and religious obligations that people would have had, dealing with feasts and Sabbath days and some of the rules surrounding them. You start to see about the Sabbaths for the land and for the animals and things like that that are also mentioned. And then finally, there's some rules given regarding the upcoming Canaanite conquest. Remember, we are still with the people at Sinai. They have not yet rebelled against the Lord and been sentenced to their 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And so they're expecting that God has brought them in the wilderness. He's going to do some things with them, and then they are going to go on to the promised land. They are on the path for that. And so God gives them kind of a preview of how he expects some of those events to happen, how he expects them to retake the land, and how he'll work with them in that place. That all happens in 21 through 23. Lots of action here. We mostly talked about the indentured servitude part. That's Exodus 21, 1 through 11. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we'll start off with the first few verses. Scripture says, "Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master hath given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. And if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. What this passage and the subsequent verses going through verse 11 do is they basically outline some very outer boundaries of the entire indentured servant relationship. It places limits on how long a Hebrew servant was, a national, was able to sell themselves for. They couldn't sell themselves indefinitely out the gate, right? Eventually, they could make that decision, but they couldn't do that immediately. It had to be for 6 years. Now, even though we see words like buy and slave used in various places throughout Scripture, for the most part, in most contexts, it definitely has much more the appearance of indentured servitude. The idea that someone, either to pay off a debt or to claim something, to receive something in return, they basically sell their time. They basically become a contract laborer for this period of time. There are limits to that, making it, I'm not trying to sugarcoat it and make it sound like it was, contracting for a company down the street kind of experience. But certainly it was much more businesslike than what you would expect of slavery in pre-Civil War America, for example. It was much more a person's exchange of their time and effort and energy. In many households, they would have been treated like family or like children. And there's the practical implications of that are touched on throughout this passage. The dealings of how wives and children were handled in this context all kind of touch on that. The key thing is there's nothing here, with the exception of this limitation on how long a Hebrew servant could initially sell themselves for, there's nothing here to prevent that servant and master from contracting for different things than what's outlined here. What do I mean by that? Well, an easy example would be if a servant's in a household and he's going to choose to get married, knowing that the rule by default is, since he wasn't married when he came and he's getting married while he's there, when his service ends, he's leaving without his wife and kids. So knowing that fact, what would you do if you're in that situation? You'd make an agreement at this point, right? You would figure out how it's going to be different before you get married, and you'd have a plan for that. Now, from a very practical perspective, what is the likelihood that an indentured servant is a really upscale marriage for whoever's in this household? Pretty low, right? What is the likelihood that the indentured servant has a dowry to pay the parent of this other person for this marriage? Pretty low, right? So there's probably some practical considerations here about making sure that Mrs. and kids are going to be taken care of by somebody when this business relationship between the servant and the master end. And certainly, somebody can feel differently about it or how it should be. But remember, this is very much a patriarchal society. Fathers still have claims on daughters. It seems like this approach is arranged in a way to make sure that there is the highest likelihood that mother and children will still be taken care of whenever that business relationship ends. Because the master is the one who's going to have the funds and resources to do that by default. And if that servant wants to take his wife and children with him, he needs to make some kind of plan for that. He needs to have some kind of way that he's going to be able to provide for them and take care of them. Regardless, this is an outer boundary, right? This is the most basic set of default rules for if nobody coordinates anything else. It doesn't prevent them from making different plans. This passage also, if we were to read through it, it explains that despite this 6-year term of service rule, women who are sold into indentured service don't get the same treatment as men. Women who are in this service, they could expect to be married either to their masters or their masters' sons. And if that expectation wasn't fulfilled, they were still to be provided for or to be released from service. They were not to be used and abused or mistreated or sold off to other people. That was not an option. Regarding personal injury, Exodus chapter 21, verses 12 through 36, all deal with murder or other types of personal injury between people. We're not going to read that whole passage. There's really a series of sections. The first deals with murder directly. Verse 12 of chapter 21, he that smiteth a man so that he die, he shall be surely put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar, that he may die. The scriptures explicitly, and we discussed this in the context of the Ten Commandments, and thou shalt not kill, just as God had told Noah so many years before, the consequence of murder is the death penalty. Nonetheless, the law made provision for what we today would call manslaughter, that non-premeditated murder, the accidental killing of another. It's not all worked out in this particular passage. It's largely handled in the book of Leviticus. But God appointed cities, what were called cities of refuge, places that someone who accidentally killed another could flee to. And basically, the consequence of manslaughter, and I'm giving the very much paraphrased Nelson version of this, but the very basic rule was, if you accidentally killed somebody, the law of retaliation or revenge kicked in. And under those rules of law, the family of your victim, even an unintended victim, had the right to kill you. Your safety net, your opportunity to plead your cause and escape death, required you to flee to one of these cities of refuge, which were specific cities arranged throughout the nation of Israel, where you could then go to the judges there and plead your case. If those judges found you to be guilty of murder, that you had in fact intentionally murdered someone, they would turn you over to the family and you'd be killed. If they found you to be innocent isn't really the right word. They found you to be guilty of manslaughter and unintentional killing, then they would basically provide you a place of refuge that you could stay until the high priest died. And after that time, then you could return home and the family could not avenge themselves upon you. If you refused to do that, if you left the city of refuge, the family could kill you. That was the basic process. Now, this sounds pretty foreign to us, right? In Western societies, we tend to frown on people doing what we call taking the law into their own hands. But you have to remember, this is a society that is, at this point, still very nomadic. Many people within the society will continue to be fairly nomadic afterwards. People are not nearly able to travel the same way. There are not large organized groups of law enforcement agents. And often there's lots of people who don't know what's going on, right? People are broken up very badly. And so the system that's in place allows for the people who are closest and most impacted to exercise judgment in how they deal with these types of issues. The key thing to take away from this passage is, if you commit premeditated murder, the penalty is death. If you commit accidental murder, then provision is made for you to escape that penalty, but it is not without consequence. Life is highly regarded. The passage moves on from talking about murder specifically to injuries done to others. It talks about how if men fight together and one is wounded and it takes him a while to convalesce, basically, he can get up and about, but he can't necessarily go to work. The person who's wounded is to be repaid for their time and supported until they're all healed. It talks about the beating of servants. I had mentioned earlier that there were certainly some things that we might look askance at and go, well, that sounds a lot like chattel slavery, where a master can simply beat their servant and get away with it. Basically, the minimal law here that's set is you can't beat your servant and kill them directly. And if you do so, then that's punishable by death. But if you beat them and just wound them, it's not. It's just like your property. This passage deals with men who are fighting and they injure a woman who's pregnant, cause her to lose her baby. It deals with payments that happen because of that. It deals with the consequences if there's further harm that comes to that woman from the loss of her baby, and reiterates this concept of the law of revenge or retaliation. Probably one of those few passages that people outside of church or outside of familiarity with the scriptures might remember. Verse 24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. The establishment of this concept, which we tend to look on perhaps with a little bit of shock, a little bit of surprise, because it says, hey, basically what you reap, what you sow. If you commit this damage, you suffer this consequence of equal consideration. But in this time and in this context, that was a limiting factor. That was saying, hey, it can't be worse than that. You can't just kill somebody because they hurt you, right? It was actually limiting down, scaling down the level of punishment that was allowed for a particular action or a particular injury. Provisions made for releasing servants who are gravely injured in their service as a consequence for the injuries that they suffer. There's a great deal of discussion around the treatment of animals, and kind of, if you think about a very agrarian society, a very agricultural society, dealing with animals that hurt others, that have danger associated with them, and how the owners of those animals have a responsibility to restrain them. If you read through this passage, if you're familiar at all with the laws and rules around dog bites, you kind of see exactly where it came from here. It's very, very similar to even very modern Western law around dealing with dangerous dogs. Basically, there's an old adage, every dog gets one bite, that still generally applies today. A dog who's never been a problem before and bites somebody generally is not going to be euthanized for that. There might be consequences as a result of that. The owner might have to pay something or provide for medical bills and things like that. But generally speaking, we don't kill a dog on one bite. But after that first one, when it's happened before and someone allows it to happen again, we'll generally have the dog euthanized. That's the law in most jurisdictions in the U.S. It's very common. We see very similar things here in Scripture. It's in the context of an ox. You think about the kind of animals they were raising, and it kind of makes sense. Provision is made for making restitution when injury is caused by something that the owner possesses, whether it's an ox or some other type of animal, whether it's a person digging a pit and not properly marking it and an animal falling into it or something like that. Those types of damage are accounted for. Chapter 22 of Exodus begins to talk about theft. And I found this pretty interesting. We're going to read the first 4 verses here and talk briefly about it, because I think it's a good example of the sort of thing that we really, these laws are not binding on us. These were civil laws in the context of the children of Israel. But certainly the God who promulgated them has higher standards of us. And so they are for our education, our instruction. Chapter 22, verse 1. If a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. Okay, that kind of makes sense. You steal something, you get caught, you give back more. If a thief be found breaking up and be smitten that he die, there shall no blood be shed for him. Okay, so if a thief is in the process of thieving and he's smitten that he dies, there's no murder that's occurred. There's an exemption here, right? We're not shedding blood for him, even though he was killed, because he was in the process of breaking up, of burglaring. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him, for he should make full restitution. If he have nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the theft be certainly found in his hand alive, whether it be ox or ass or sheep, he shall restore double. Okay, so verses 3 and 4, we've progressed. If he was found breaking up and he was smitten and died, no blood was to be shed for him. If the sun be risen upon him, there shall be blood shed for him, for he should make full restitution. This is one of the kind of rare situations where I pretty strongly disagree with one of my commentators, at least, Mr. Ryrie here. And I'm not going to elaborate on how he worked through it. He seemed to kind of think there's a different rule by day or by night. And I sort of understand how he got there, but I think the implication here is really fairly clear. There is an assumption that thieves work at night. That's a pretty reasonable assumption. Experience, both personal and more broadly, tells you thieves tend to do their thieving thing at night. And I think that assumption is built in here. So the idea is, if the sun be risen upon him, in other words, if you come upon the person in the day where you can see what's going on, where you can experience, you're not in a situation where you don't know the dangers. And the thief is smitten and dies, there shall be blood shed for him. Why? Because you didn't have to be in danger of your life. You knew what was going on. When it happens at night, you don't know what's going on. Remember, we're not talking about a super well-lit society here in the middle of the night, right? No electric lights or indoor plumbing going on here. So there was much more uncertainty. If things are happening by day, I can see that the thieving is happening. I am safe in my person, but not my property. I'm not to kill the thief. And why is that? Well, the verse tells us, for he should make full restitution. There is provision made for dealing with thieves. And the provision that's made for dealing with thieves is restitution. They're going to provide things back. And if he doesn't have anything, he's going to be sold into that indentured servitude thing we talked about so that restitution can be made. You know, we joke a lot in our society about the softening of society and challenges we have. You'll hear, I'm sure you all are too refined to have ever heard these kinds of jokes, but occasionally you'll hear jokes about shooting the thief and dragging him into the house, so there's no question as to what happened kind of thing. Scripture regards life highly. And while there may be specific passages of Scripture that we look upon and we think, man, what a brutal society. How barbaric. In the grand scheme of things, Scripture elevates the value of life. And Christians, believers, even in ancient Jewish times, they weren't to be killing people to protect property because people were more important. The provision that's made here in this passage is that, you know what, if the thief is breaking up, If there is a situation that exacerbates the danger to the individual, you absolutely have the right to protect yourself, right? You can't know what a thief in your house in the middle of the night is doing. But if you're coming upon it in the daytime, if you're seeing the cattle rustler out in the field, you're not to kill him, because he can make restitution, and restitution is to be made. I think when we see a passage like this, we should take note. We should think to ourselves, is the standard for New Testament believers lower or higher? And if you were here when we worked through the Sermon on the Mount, where we talked about these things a great deal, you know what I think the answer is. I think it's a lot higher, not just a little higher. We can learn from passages like this the most basic boundaries that God set on people in this time with very limited revelation. But we can also be inspired to greater service to a thrice holy God, and to recognize that what's expected of us is more. Whether it's our dealings directly with God and worshiping Him properly, or our dealings with our fellow believers, who we ought to love and care for, as Paul talks about so often, or whether it's our dealings with the world around us, people who mistreat us in the most obvious ways, who break the most basic societal norms, and yet we are still to care for them and to desire their well-being. Let's ponder these things as we close today and through this week. Next week, we're going to finish up chapters 22 and 23, and we will start in talking about the ratification of the covenant that God is going to make with His people. We're going to get introduced to some folks you may recognize, Nadab and Abihu, who many of you are probably thinking of. We'll have some major stories about them later on as well. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord,